This week on The Olive Tree, we're back in Netanya talking to David Loden. He and his wife Lisa met in the United States many years ago. They moved to Israel in 1974 and as believers were pioneers in the Messianic movement in Israel. David is a professional classical musician. His love for music, as he now explains, began as a young child.
I started writing music when I was about 8 years old. I loved listening to Bach. My mother introduced me to Bach. There were no other musicians in my family that I know of that we were able to trace. But she had a love for music, and she played sort of piano and wanted me to study piano. So I started to study piano. I didn't particularly enjoy practicing, so I didn't keep that up as long as I should have in order to be a pianist, actually. But I started to love Bach, and I wanted to write music in the style of Bach. So I wrote a couple of things, even at 8 or 9 years old, in the style of Bach. At age 16, I started singing in choirs, and at age 17, I directed my first choir, actually. And then at 18, I was a part of the Roger Wagner Chorale, which is a professional choral society in Hollywood, and thought of at the time as one of the three best in the world. I have to include Huddersfield Society, Choral Society, which many of your listeners will be aware of. And I started at that point to study voice also. But the first thing I ever did was compose. So that stuck with me. Now I'm composing again and so grateful to be able to do that. And it was also a little funny because I'm teaching my granddaughter, one of my granddaughters, Shaked is her name, and she's 9 years old. And I'm teaching her a little bit of music. And she's a brilliant, brilliant kid, but very active mind. And so it's hard to kind of get her pinned down, to particularly because I'm her Saba, her grandfather, So it's hard to do. But I'm looking and say, what do you really want to do? She says, I'd like to write some music. Oh, well, maybe I can help in that, Since I started right about your age doing the same thing. She's written 2 songs, or she's written one song, which we performed actually at Passover, a Passover song. She's written another song. She writes beautiful, beautiful melodies. I thought, my goodness, where's this come from? And I said,
Wow. Maybe you know where it's come from. Were you born into a Jewish family?
I was not born into a Jewish family. I think I know that there's Jewish blood in my lineage, but my family basically was not Jewish and not practicing Jewish. I am a convert to Judaism, and this was something that happened very early on when I first became a believer. It's a long story and one which probably many people may have some difficulty with, but it's my walk and it's my life and my calling.
But your wife is Jewish.
Yes, she absolutely is. Yes. As a matter of fact, Russian Jews. Her grandfather was a Jewish activist in the early 1900s and was pursued by the KGB for, put off in the precursors of the KGB.
There's a real story there.
Yeah, no, this was real Jewish activism.
And you and Lisa met, you lived a hippie lifestyle for some time in the States, but you were also very close to a Christian who had a profound influence on both of you, didn't he? Merle.
That's right. You remembered his name. How wonderful. I was living in New York in the theater, I've been in the theater. I really wanted to make my life in theater and music. And I told my mother this when I was like 19 or 20 years old, I think it was. And she says, well, that's really great, son. I support you in all this, but how are you going to make a living? Which was the reality check, which I probably needed. But I went out and did it anyway. I was living in New York in the theater and working in the theater, and I was a city hippie, if you want to put it that way. I was the production manager for the Joffrey Ballet. It's a very large ballet company, one of the fine ballet companies of that time. They're still very good now, but they were cutting edge at that time. And I took them on a tour to Seattle, and there we finished that tour, and they went back home, and I decided I needed some time where I just wanted to go out in the woods. So a friend of mine from the from the ballet company, and I went up into the Olympic Peninsula, which is a wilderness area and a national forest west of Seattle. Many people don't know that there is actually something west of Seattle. Seattle's on Puget Sound, but there's a whole 200-mile peninsula on the other side of it. So out there was a very primitive area, and we had a wonderful time for a few days. And then we came out of the woods, and I had rental cars. We were going to drive around a bit and then go back to Seattle and catch the plane back to New York. And we stopped in the peninsula, a little place called the Sappho Cafe in Sappho, Washington. I can give you all sorts of very, very funny answers as to where that is. But
in the middle of nowhere.
We had in the middle of nowhere, just a logging camp, basically, that happened to have a gas station, petrol station, which had a burger bar also with it. The guy made hamburgers, basically. So we went in to get a hamburger. Really needed something after eating, all this fish and stuff that we would catch from the river. And I saw this woman, this young girl, sitting behind a pile of books at a table, and I could hardly see her for the books. And I went over and I looked at her, and she looked to be about 14, 15 years old. Turns out she was not. But at all events, one thing led to another, and we took her home. She was a woods hippie. She was living in the woods as a hermit. We became enamored of one another. We spent a good 22 hours together, and I had to go back to New York. So I said, I will be back. Ordinarily, when I said something like that in those days, it probably didn't mean much, but I meant it this time. I went back home, and I went back to New York, and we started the new season with the company, and I wanted to communicate with her. So I started to write a letter. Then all of a sudden occurred to me, David Loden, dumbhead, occurred to me that I didn't know her name. I mean, I knew it was Lisa. I didn't know what her surname was, and I had no idea how to address it. She lived in a cabin in the middle of the woods that was accessible. The nearest other living human being was like 5 miles away. So how on the earth am I supposed to address this? So I wrote the letter, addressed the envelope to Lisa the Lovely, Sappho, Washington. Put it in a mailbox. It got there. Don't ask me how it got there. But she got it. She actually got it. And we started this correspondence. I went back, and we began to live together. And I, at that point, we became married because we wanted to be committed to one another. And we realized that commitment was the most important thing in this situation, that if we did not have some sort of formal commitment, we probably would not last. So we did we married each other, and then we came to the Lord.
And that was the start of such a huge change in your life. But
yes,
you were still in the States. We have to now ask the question, what drew you both to Israel?
The man who came down, one of the two people who would come down to see us in the woods, basically, because it was not easy to get there. You have to go through the logging roads and so forth to get to us. The Merle that you mentioned, Merle Watson, he would come down and he would speak to us and he would love us. He was my boss. When I worked at a mill making roofing products out of cedar logs. And he would come down and speak to us. And he spoke to us about the Lord, of course, as well. No, he didn't, actually, at the beginning. He didn't. He just spoke to us. And in the mill, he would hire hippies. He hired me, hired a few of the other hippies in the area. He was a tremendously loving brother and a very different from all the other people around who were pretty not very nice to the hippie community who were living sort of in their midst in the woods. Excuse me. So He would come down to see us, and some other people. One other person would come down to see us. I won't mention who, but he as it turns out, the one who eventually shared his faith with me, brought me to the Lord, and then Lisa as well. He was an elder in the Assembly of God Church in Forks, Washington. Some of you have watched the Twilight series on television may remember Forks, Washington. It's the area where we were living, where that whole thing was filmed. That whole series was filmed. And he was an elder in this church, and they taught really good biblical teaching, and they taught from the Old Testament. And the subject of Israel was brought up on numbers of occasions. Well, of course, for Lisa, who was natively Jewish, for myself, who was keenly interested in this, it became one of the most important things of our very early teaching. And so we began to go around and to speak and to sing. I was writing music, which all of a sudden became Christian music. And then we would sing for churches all up and down the West Coast of the United States and other places as well. And finally, we would talk about Israel. When we would share, we'd say, "There's interest in Israel. We'd like to go there to visit. We'd like to go there to," and then it became, we would like to go there for some time and see what it's like, maybe an extended time. And then it became, I think we'd like to live there. So we kind of grew into it in some sort of a way that I can only say was probably the leading of the Spirit of the Lord.
You've been listening to David Loden, and we'll hear more of his extraordinary story on next week's programme. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please visit our website, olivetreefund.org. Meanwhile, join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.